15 years ago, Mateo Reyes was nothing more than a struggling widowed father who saw a homeless girl shivering under the awning of a bus station and decided to take her home. He gave her his last name, gave her a bed, and gave her a reason to believe that the world still held decent people. 15 years later, that same man was dragged into a courtroom, labeled a fraud, and told he was about to lose an empire worth 900 million pesos. But when the courtroom doors finally swung open wide, the girl from that rainy night walked in wearing a lawyer suit. If stories of quiet loyalty and courtroom twists that leave you breathless are what you love, press subscribe now and stay with us for the story that follows. The rain fell hard over Baltimore that night, the kind of cold spring downpour that turned the harbor into a sheet of hammered iron. Mateo Reyes had just finished a double shift at the docks, and the smell of motor oil and sea salt still clung to his jacket like a second skin. He was 31 then, a widower with grease permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles, and he wanted nothing more than to buy some food and get home to his son Gabriel, who would be waiting awake past his bedtime. Mateo walked past the old bus terminal with his collar turned up against the wind. His mind was already halfway to the small apartment where a boy would race to the door the moment he heard the key. That was when he saw her. A girl, perhaps 9 years old, sitting hunched under the cracked awning of the terminal, her knees drawn to her chest and a torn backpack clutched against her body like the last thing she owned in the world. Her hair was soaked. Her shoes had holes in the toes. And she watched the passers-by with the watchful stillness of a child who had learned that waiting for help usually cost more than it gave. No one had come for her. No one seemed to be looking. Mateo slowed his step, and something in his chest that had gone quiet since his wife's death began, against his will, to stir. He did not act on impulse, because impulse was a luxury poor men could not afford. Mateo knew that a grown man approaching a lost girl in the dark could frighten her more than the cold. So he kept his distance, crouched a few paces away, and asked her name in the same low voice he used to calm his own son from a nightmare. She told him her name was Valentina Cruz and nothing more. He called the local police from the payphone across the street and asked them to send someone from social services because he wanted everything done the right way, in the light, with nothing hidden. But he did not leave. He bought a carton of warm milk from the all-night deli counter and a cheap coat from the 24-hour shop on the corner and placed both beside her without a word. She did not thank him. Not at first. She only studied the coat and the milk as if they might be a trap. And after a long moment, she asked him a single question that would stay lodged in his heart for the rest of his life. She asked, "Are you coming back?" Mateo went still. He knew that question. He had heard it in his own son's voice on the nights he worked late, and he had felt its weight in his own childhood chest, waiting on a porch for a father who never returned. He looked at this soaking, distrustful, motherless child and understood that she was not asking about that night. She was asking whether anyone in the whole world would choose to stay with her. The months that followed were made of paperwork and patience. Mateo submitted to the interviews, the home visits, the endless forms, and slowly became her legal guardian. And then, in a small county office with fluorescent lights and a tired clerk, he became her father. He was not rich when he did it. He was not powerful, and he had nothing to prove to anyone who was watching because no one was watching. He took Valentina in for the simplest reason a person can have, which was simple kindness offered at a moment when he himself could barely keep his head above water. The day the adoption was finalized, he placed a house key in her small palm and folded her fingers over it. And he told her something she would carry with her for 15 years. He said, "In this house, no one stays out in the rain." That sentence became the promise at the center of everything that followed. Time passed as it always does, faster than anyone expects. Mateo kept his job at the docks during the day, repairing tractor units and stubborn diesel engines, and at night at the kitchen table under a lamp with a bent shade, he taught himself the freight business. He noticed what the men in suits never bothered to see, that the entire industry bled money through 1,000 small wounds. Trucks returned empty on their return trips. Cold storage sat idle, waiting for orders that came too late. Containers sat frozen on the docks for days simply because the big companies hoarded their data like misers and refused to coordinate. Mateo had spent his whole life inside those wounds, and he began to imagine, engine by engine and route by route, how a man might stitch them closed. From a narrow garage with a leaking roof, he founded Reyes Port Services with 3 used trucks and a rudimentary dispatch program that Gabriel and Valentina helped him refine once they were old enough to sit at the keyboard. What Mateo had and others lacked could not be bought at any price. He understood the workers. He understood the drivers, the mechanics, the longshoremen who moved the cargo on their own backs because he had been every one of them. He did not build his company from a boardroom. He built it with mud and sweat and the simple honor of meeting a delivery deadline he had promised. And word spread among the men who mattered that Reyes was a man who could be trusted. Valentina grew up inside that world and absorbed from her adoptive father a patience and a self-respect that no school could teach. She was never the fragile creature in the corner. She appeared in the story of those years as a series of small bright flashes. A teenager standing in the oily light of the garage reading a worn book on contract law, listening while Matteo explained the fine print of a shipping agreement, asking him why it was that poor people always seemed to lose the moment they failed to understand the paperwork. Matteo did not have an easy answer, but he gave her the truest one he had. He said, "In this life you may not have money, but never sign anything you haven't read to the last word." That single sentence planted a seed that would one day grow into everything. Valentina decided she would study law. And when the tuition bills arrived, Matteo sold the first truck he had ever bought to cover them. Though the company badly needed the cash that season, Gabriel, who was older and had begun to think of the girl as a true sister, stood beside his father and said that if Valentina wanted to be a lawyer, then the whole family would carry that dream together. In 15 years, Reyes Port Services swelled into Reyes Port and Rail, a logistics empire worth nearly 900 million pesos with dry ports, cold chain warehouses, and a private rail line that crossed state borders. But the bigger the company grew, the stranger Matteo was forced to sit around his board table. And that, though he did not yet know it, was where the danger began. In the present, Matteo Reyes was no longer a ruined mechanic with grease under his nails. He was the founder of an empire that owned dry ports, refrigerated warehouses, a private railroad, and federal shipping contracts that moved goods up and down the entire East Coast. And yet he still wore the same worn canvas jacket he had worn on the docks. He still laced up his steel-toed work boots every morning and still ate lunch sitting on an upturned crate beside the drivers rather than in any glass-walled dining room. To the men who moved the cargo, that simplicity made him a king worth following. To the board, it made him a relic. Bartholomew Sterling, the chairman of that board, had decided that a man who ate lunch with truckers was no longer fit to run a corporation approaching $1 billion in value. He was a polished creature of committees and quiet lunches, and had come to see Matteo's simple habits as a weakness to be exploited rather than a virtue to be honored. Sterling formed a private alliance with Regina Vance, the CEO of Vance Acri, a woman who came from old financial blood and wore her ambition like other people wore perfume. Together, they devised a plan to force Matteo to surrender his controlling shares at a fraction of their value and then swallow the entire empire he had built with 3 rusted trucks. Their plan was patient and precise. Sterling orchestrated a lawsuit built around an old military transport contract. And he accused Matteo of using company assets to fund a private trust for his family and, more pointedly, for Valentina, the adopted daughter who shared no blood with him. The goal was to convince a court to freeze Matteo's voting rights, tear him from the founder's chair, and then sell the mutilated company directly into the arms of Vance Acri. It was elegant, and it was cruel, and it was designed to make Matteo's greatest act of decency look like the mechanism of a fraud. What took Matteo by surprise was that the documents his enemies produced all bore a signature that looked exactly like his own. The trust account that had been created in Valentina's name was twisted and reframed as evidence that he had been quietly bleeding the company to enrich a girl he had picked off the street. The story leaked, and soon the very people who had once praised his rise began to call him a hypocrite, a sentimental fraud who wrapped his greed in the language of charity. Gabriel burned to strike back immediately, to storm the press and tear the accusations apart. But Matteo held him back with a hand on his shoulder and the calm of a man who had survived worse storms. He believed that truth had its own current, and that if he refused to panic, it would find its way to the surface in time. Still, what hurt him was not the threat to his fortune. He had been poor before and knew he could survive being poor again. What cut him to the bone was the way they used Valentina's past. The way they took the most human act of his life and called it a weakness, a sentimental error that a serious man would never have made. They spoke of the frightened girl under the awning as if she were a liability on a balance sheet, and they suggested that his love for her had rotted his judgment. On the final night before everything came to a head, a messenger arrived at Matteo's door with a subpoena, and the notice made the schedule brutally clear. In 72 hours, a hearing would decide the fate of everything he had built. When the crisis broke, everyone who loved Matteo searched for Valentina. She had become a young lawyer based in Washington, specializing in the tangled worlds of trust law and corporate law, precisely the fields that now threatened to consume her father. She was, by any measure, the best equipped living person to defend him. But in the exact hour Matteo needed her most, Valentina did not answer her phone. Her office only said she was unavailable. Her apartment was dark. Messages went unanswered, and the silence stretched like a held breath. That silence bred suspicion, and suspicion is a hungry thing. Had Valentina turned her back on the man who raised her, choosing her career over the father whose name she bore? Had Vance's money reached her first and bought her loyalty? Or was she hiding some secret of her own, some truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud? Bartholomew Sterling seized on her absence as a gift and fed it to the press with smooth, sorrowful wisdom. He told anyone who would listen that even Matteo Reyes's own adopted daughter would not rise to defend him, and surely that told the world that something rotten lived inside the Reyes family. Regina Vance, in a cold interview delivered from a marble lobby, commented that an empire could never be run on pity and that sentimentality had finally caught up with an old fool. Matteo did not blame Valentina. In the quiet of his study, he lifted an old photograph from his desk, a faded image from a rainy night at a bus terminal, and in it a small girl wore the cheap coat he had bought her and stood beside a young Gabriel, smiling so faintly that you had to know her to see it. He held the photograph a long time. Then he told Julia Holloway, the loyal legal secretary who had been at his side for years, that Valentina owed him nothing at all. He had not taken her in so that one day she would pay a debt. He had taken her in because a girl was cold, and no arithmetic of gratitude had ever entered into it. That refusal to treat love as a debt made Matteo larger in that dark hour, not smaller. What no one in Baltimore knew was that Valentina had not disappeared out of fear or betrayal. She was hundreds of miles away, moving through the back rooms of an old law firm, searching for the original of a trust document that Julia Holloway had been entrusted to keep safe. And in the course of that search, she had discovered something that changed the entire shape of the accusation. The fund that bore her name was not money Matteo had siphoned from the company at all. It was a founder's protective trust established long before Reyes Port and Rail went public, built with the express purpose of protecting the founding principles of the company from exactly the kind of predators now circling it. Late on the second night, in a dusty record vault that smelled of old paper, Valentina found what she had come for. It was a sealed archive box, its edges frayed by time, and on the front, in Matteo's own careful handwriting, were words she read 3 times before she trusted them. The box was labeled, "For Valentina Reyes, when the court finally asks who holds the promise." She sat on the cold floor with the box in her lap, and for the first time in 15 years, the frightened girl and the sharp young lawyer became the same person again. The hearing convened in the Federal Commercial Court on a grey morning, and the air inside the chamber was formal, cold, and heavy with pressure. Matteo sat at the defense table beside a temporary lawyer who had inherited a case he did not fully understand. Across the aisle, Bartholomew Sterling commanded an expensive phalanx of lawyers led by the notorious Elliot Winford, a man who had built his career strangling opponents with the very contracts they had signed. Judge Amanda Ellison presided, a stern jurist famously unbribable who had thrown richer men than Sterling out of her courtroom, and she asked both sides to state their positions clearly. The question before her was whether Matteo Reyes had abused company assets to build a private fund, and whether his voting rights should be suspended while the matter was resolved. Winford opened with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand. He put the bank transfers on the screen, then the trust agreements, then Matteo's signature enlarged to fill the wall, and finally, deliberately, the adoption papers themselves. He painted a portrait for the court, a sentimental single father who had brought a homeless girl into his home and then, blinded by affection, quietly channeled company assets into her care. It was a masterful and poisonous performance because it attacked not just Matteo's finances but his dignity, taking the kindest thing the man had done and reconfiguring it into the weapon aimed at his heart. Winford turned to Matteo and asked him directly, before the packed gallery, whether he had adopted a girl named Valentina Reyes. Matteo answered yes. Winford asked whether he had established a fund in her name. Matteo answered yes again. A murmur ran through the chamber like a current, and outside the court, the story flashed instantly across every wire. Founder confessed to moving assets to adopted daughter. Bartholomew Sterling allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Regina Vance sat in the back gallery with the quiet serenity of a woman who had already read the last page of the book. Matteo's borrowed lawyer rose to explain that the trust was entirely legal, created for legitimate purposes, but without the original terms in hand, his words sounded weak and defensive, and the judge's expression did not soften. The momentum in the room had tilted hard against the defense, and the machinery of the law began, slowly and inexorably, to move toward freezing Matteo's control over his own company. Judge Alyson looked up from her papers and asked the question that would decide everything. She asked whether the defense had any other witness or document to present. Matteo's lawyer fell silent. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom remained closed. Valentina had not arrived. And then, at the exact moment the judge raised a pen to sign a preliminary order, those doors swung open wide. A young woman in a tailored dark suit walked in with an old leather briefcase under her arm, and she did not hurry, and she did not look frightened, and she did not offer a nervous apology for the interruption. She walked directly to the clerk's table with the steady step of someone who had rehearsed this entrance 100 times, and said in a clear, even voice, "Valentina Reyes, counsel of record for the defense. I move to present emergency evidence." The entire chamber fell silent. Matteo turned in his chair and looked at her, and for one suspended moment, he did not see a lawyer at all. He saw a soaking 9-year-old girl under the awning of a bus terminal asking if anyone would ever come back for her. But Valentina did not let the emotion of that look weaken her. She stood straight, her chin level, her voice firm and professional, and she waited for the court to recognize her as any officer of the court would wait. Whatever storm of feeling moved beneath her calm surface, she had locked it behind 15 years of the patience her father had taught her. Elliot Winford rose immediately, objecting that Valentina Reyes carried a clear conflict of interest, being the adopted daughter of the very defendant whose fortune was at stake. Valentina answered him without a flash of heat. She answered that since the plaintiffs had chosen to make her identity and her adoption the centerpiece of their accusations, she had every right to appear both as a witness to the truth of that trust and as supporting counsel on the matter of its terms. The logic was clean, and it turned Winford's own strategy against him, and Judge Alyson, after a long, measured look at both, allowed Valentina to present a preliminary statement. Valentina opened the leather briefcase and drew out the original Reyes Founders Trust, the document that had been created years before the company grew into a corporation. She presented it to the court and guided the judge through its simple language, and that language demonstrated something no one on the plaintiff's side wanted demonstrated. Matteo had not moved company assets into his adopted daughter's hands. He had done the opposite. He had placed a portion of his founder's shares into a protective trust with the express purpose of preventing the board from selling the company in violation of the principles on which it had been built. The fund was not a theft. It was a wall. That was the first reversal, and it landed hard. Valentina Reyes was not the secret recipient of stolen money. She was the designated guardian of the founder's shares. The person Matteo had chosen to protect the heart of the company in case he were ever forced out of it by fraud. The girl the plaintiffs had presented as proof of Matteo's corruption was, under the simple terms of his own document, the only safeguard he had built against exactly the kind of corruption now surrounding him. Valentina turned then and looked across the aisle at Bartholomew Sterling and spoke without raising her voice. She said, "The question was never what my father took out of this company. The question is who is trying to sell what was never theirs to sell." Valentina moved to her second piece of evidence, and it was one Elliot Winford could not resist scoffing at. She produced a handwritten letter from Matteo dated the day her adoption was finalized, and Winford sneered openly that a sentimental family note had no weight in a court of law. But Valentina was ready for the sneer. She showed that this letter had not been kept in a drawer as a keepsake. It had been formally attached to the trust documents as the founder's statement of intent, incorporated by reference into the legal instrument itself, and therefore spoke with the force of the trust that contained it. She read it, and the courtroom grew very still. In the letter, Matteo had written that he had lost his family once and would not stand by while anyone else was left behind simply because they lacked a great name or a fortune. He had written that he was not establishing the trust to enrich Valentina, but to protect the company from the kind of men who would one day try to turn it into a machine for their own speculation. And he had written one line that now seemed to reach across the years and touch the very room in which they sat today. He had written that if the board ever used Valentina's past as a weapon against the Reyes family, that act itself would be proof that they had betrayed the founding spirit of the company, and the trust's protections must be activated the moment such a betrayal occurred. The chamber was silent in a different way now. The silence of people who have seen a trap close but cannot yet say who is inside it. The letter was not merely moving. It was structural. It connected directly to a specific clause buried in the founder's trust, a clause that stated clearly that if the board sought to sell controlling shares to a third party by fabricating a false accusation against the founder, then a reserve voting authority would pass to the trust's guardian. And the trust's guardian, named in the document years before, was Valentina. Elliot Winford objected furiously that the clause had long since expired, that any protection it once offered had lapsed with time. Valentina answered by producing the annual renewals, each filed precisely on time every year by Julia Holloway. Julia Holloway was called to the stand, and the old secretary swore oath with the quiet firmness of a woman who had waited a long time to tell the truth. She confirmed that Matteo had always kept the trust transparent, had reported it fully, and had filed its renewals without fail. And then she confirmed what turned the entire gallery cold. Bartholomew Sterling had deliberately hidden those reports from the rest of the board, burying the very documents that would have shown the trust was legitimate so that when his fabricated lawsuit arrived, no director would remember that Matteo had done everything in the light of day. Across the aisle, Regina Vance's composure finally cracked at the edges because she understood before anyone else in the room that if this clause was recognized as valid, her entire acquisition would crumble to dust. Matteo watched Valentina work, and the pride in his chest was almost more than he could contain, though he contained it because that too was something he had taught her. She had not only come to defend him. She had come carrying everything he had tried to give her. The habit of reading a document to its last word, the refusal to break a promise, and the simple iron conviction that powerful people had no right to rewrite the truth simply because they could afford better lawyers than the men they trampled. The girl he had sheltered from a storm had become the woman who now sheltered him from another, and the symmetry of it sat heavy and sweet in his throat. Then Valentina stopped defending and began to attack. She no longer only protected her father. She set out to prove that the plaintiffs had built the entire lawsuit as an instrument to steal the company outright. She entered a chain of internal messages passing between Bartholomew Sterling and Regina Vance, and in them the two conspirators spoke with the careless cruelty of people who believed no one would ever read their words aloud. Sterling had agreed to apply legal pressure to reduce the price of Reyes Port and Rail before Vance Acquery made its formal purchase offer. They referred to Matteo as the old mechanic with a family weakness, and they referred to Valentina herself as the emotional card that could be turned into a financial accusation. Those words hit Matteo like a physical blow, but they also stripped the last mask from the men and women arrayed against him, and the whole court saw at last the coldness beneath the tailored suits. Elliot Winford scrambled to argue that the messages had been altered, cut, and pasted out of context to deceive the court. Valentina was waiting for exactly that objection. She entered the metadata, the digital signatures, and the certification from an independent forensic examiner who had verified every line. Because she had known from the start that her opponents would never concede an inch without fighting, and she had built her case in overlapping layers that could not be dismantled. Then she delivered the blow beneath the blow. Valentina produced records of a payment routed from a shell company controlled by Vance Acquery to a consulting account belonging to Bartholomew Sterling. The transfer had been labeled with almost laughable arrogance as a strategic advisory fee. But the date of that payment fell on the same day Sterling had filed his lawsuit against Matteo, and no jury and no judge in the world could believe that timing was a coincidence. Judge Ellison turned to Sterling and demanded, in a voice that had gone flat and dangerous, that he explain the payment. For the first time in the entire proceeding, Bartholomew Sterling hesitated, and the smooth confidence drained from his face, and he had no answer that did not condemn him. The largest reversal came when Valentina produced the minutes of a private meeting. Sealed records in which Sterling had promised Vance that if Matteo's voting rights could be frozen, the board would sell 51% of Reyes Port and Rail at 40% below its actual value. That single fact detonated in the chamber because it revealed that the plan would not only rob Matteo, it would get every shareholder, betray every employee, and deliver thousands of working families to a buyer who intended to dismantle the company for parts. Judge Ellison's attitude shifted visibly toward the defense, and she ordered an immediate halt to any transaction involving Vance Acquery until the full body of evidence could be examined. Valentina faced the gallery and said, "They called my father a man who exploited family sentiment, but they are the ones who plan to sell thousands of working families into silence for a quiet profit." Regina Vance was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and she rose now to fight with the only weapon she had left. She signaled her counsel to open a line of questioning directed straight at Valentina's identity, hoping to shake the young lawyer's credibility and poison her testimony in the court's eyes. It was a calculated cruelty, an attempt to make Valentina's own history the thing that discredited her. And for a moment, The temperature in the room dropped as everyone braced for what came next. Elliot Winford forced Valentina back through the wounds of her childhood one by one. He asked about the night she had spent homeless, about the fact that she had never known her biological parents, about the tuition Matteo had paid to send her to law school. His purpose was transparent. He wanted to present her as a woman so buried in gratitude that she could not be objective. A debtor testifying to protect the man who owned her loyalty. The pressure grew thick and suffocating, and every eye in the gallery turned to the young lawyer to see if she would break. Valentina did not break. She stood perfectly still and let the silence work for her rather than against her. She admitted everything freely and without shame. She said Matteo had given her a home, a name, an education, a life, and she would never pretend otherwise. But then she turned the confession into her sharpest argument. She said that precisely because Matteo had given her those things, she understood better than any living person the difference between a debt and a promise. A debt is something you pay to free yourself. A promise is something you keep for who you have chosen to be. She had not come to that court to pay an emotional debt. She had come because the documents in her hands proved the truth, and the truth needed no gratitude to be real. Then Valentina revealed the piece of evidence no one had seen coming. Regina Vance, she revealed, had attempted to contact her before the hearing even began. Through an intermediary, Vance had offered Valentina a partnership position at a prestigious New York firm along with a substantial sum of money on one condition, that she simply not appear in court. Valentina had recorded the entire meeting legally and completely, in full compliance with the recording laws of the state where the conversation took place, because the instinct her father had planted in her told her to protect the truth before trying to use it. The recording was played in the chamber, and the intermediary's voice rang out with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The voice said, "Vance Acquery doesn't need you to betray your father. We just need you to stay silent." Those words did more damage than any document because they exposed the true shape of the conspiracy. The conspirators had never required Valentina's betrayal. They had only required her absence. Silence itself was the instrument with which they meant to steal the company. And now that silence had been broken for the whole court to hear, Matteo looked at Valentina with an expression that held both fierce pride and the aching sorrow of a father. He understood at last what those days of her disappearance had truly cost her, the weight she had carried alone, the enemy she had walked straight toward from behind to gather the final proof. She had not abandoned him. She had stayed silent on purpose, dodging the defenses of powerful people who would have crushed her the moment they saw her coming. And she had done it without a word to the man she was protecting. Judge Ellison ordered the recording entered into the record and issued a stern warning to the plaintiffs about clear signs of witness interference, and the gallery felt the case tip finally and completely onto its new axis. With the evidence accepted and the conspiracy exposed, Valentina turned to the most important provision of the Reyes Founders Trust, the clause Matteo himself had drafted years before but had prayed he would never have to use. She read it into the record slowly so that no one could later claim she had misread it. The clause stated that if the founder were ever attacked through a financial accusation linked to his family, and if that accusation were proven to have been fabricated in service of a hostile acquisition, then the founder's voting authority would pass temporarily to the trust's independent protector. And that protector, named in the document years before, was Valentina Reyes, effective once she had reached the age of majority and held a license to practice law. The meaning of it ran through the chamber like a shift in air pressure. At the very moment Bartholomew Sterling chose to use Valentina as the instrument to destroy Matteo, he had unknowingly triggered the legal power that now resided in Valentina herself. The weapon they had forged from her past turned in her hands and became the shield that saved everything. This was the deepest reversal of the entire Odyssey, the one that made the gallery gasp aloud because the person the conspirators had dismissed as Matteo's fatal weakness turned out to be the single figure holding the key to his empire's survival. Valentina asked the court to recognize her temporary voting authority, to freeze the Vance acquisition in its entirety, to suspend Bartholomew Sterling from any role on the board, and to allow Matteo to continue running the company he had founded until the investigation reached its conclusion. Elliot Winford objected with everything he had left, his voice rising, his arguments growing wilder, but no firm ground remained beneath his feet, and everyone in the room could hear it. Judge Ellison examined the documents carefully, compared the signatures line by line, confirmed the dates on which the trust renewals had been filed, and then declared that the court had more than sufficient grounds to issue an emergency order. The preliminary ruling fell like a hammer finding its mark. Matteo's authority would not be frozen. The company sale was suspended immediately. Bartholomew Sterling was removed from all decisions affecting Reyes Port and Rail, and Valentina Reyes was formally recognized as the protector of the founder's voting authority for the duration of the investigation. A wave of stunned murmurs ran through the gallery, and Regina Vance rose to leave, but Judge Ellison ordered her to remain, informing her coldly that she might still be implicated in evidence tampering and witness obstruction. Matteo bowed his head. Not in weakness, but because he knew his empire had just been saved by the same girl who had once asked him if he would ever come back.